Hey folks, and welcome again to another Cigarette Burns film series. Now we're going to be talking about the number 8 movie of all time. This is The Godfather. This one has been talked to death, so this will be, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, a rather short one on this. There's a lot of stuff, because you can't bring a lot of new to the table when you talk about something that's been talked to death. And there's a lot of interesting stories about this film production and blah blah blah. Like Al Pacino was almost replaced until he did the scene in the diner where he shot the cop and all that kind of stuff. But I'm going to kind of just talk about why it's number 8 and why Godfather 2 is in my opinion, about 50th on the 100 greatest movies of all time, because it's quite a difference between the two, and a lot of people like to put them together. Godfather 1 set the tone for what we call the modern gangster film. Okay, so that is one of the pieces. Scorsese was, I'm sure, heavily influenced by this, and that's why he started to do his gangster genre films, which have all been spot on perfect. I mean, most of his films that he does are they're 10s in the film canon. The reason that he's not considered a premiere director, because there's only about 4 premiere directors, is because it just doesn't have the critical analysis piece that I think is fundamental for it. But I definitely think if there is one, I'm sorry, there's 6 premiere directors, but if there's one director in general that deserves to be a premiere director, because he's made a lifetime of good films and great films, is Scorsese. He is the one that is, I think, between the master class and the premiere. There is only one that I can think of that is that, and that is Scorsese. And the reason I say he's not a premiere director is because a lot of his films don't register very high on the top 500. They all are kind of lumped together in the 200s to 300s. In fact, if I was to do an exhaustive list, you would see just about every Scorsese film that's ever been made in the 200s to 300s. There is one exception to that, which is Bringing Out the Dead, which is closer to the 120 to the 110 in the greatest films of all time. But Scorsese, pound for pound, has made probably the most amount of top 500 films of any director. If I had to take a guess, I'd say it was close to 9. But maybe even 10. It's possible if you consider Wolf of Wall Street. And that is quite a statement to make. And that's why I think that he is on the bubble of being considered a premiere director. There are only 6 premiere directors: Sergei Eisenstein, Orson Welles, Alfred Hitchcock, John Huston, Stanley Kubrick, and John Ford. Those are the premiere directors, though, because they have made some of the greatest films of all time. Some of them have invented camera movements and forms of editing. So that's why they're considered premiere directors. And that's an exhaustive study in and of itself. But I'm going to skip that for just getting back to The Godfather. But it influenced one of the greatest directors of all time, which is Martin Scorsese, I'm sure, into making these type of genre films. And they are always, usually for the most part, there are some that are not as good as others. I think a notable example is the one with Johnny Depp, where he played that serial killer in Brooklyn. The name escapes me now because it wasn't really that good of a film. But I don't think that was on Depp as much as it was on the direction of that film. I think it could have been done a lot better. Whitey Bulger. I just don't remember what the name of the film was. But with The Godfather, you're talking about probably one of the most influential films for a couple of reasons that I'd like to go over. One is that it started really what we consider to be the modern gangster film. There were certainly gangster films before that. But this started the modern gangster movement. This was also during the 70s when they could use language and different things like that. So you were seeing a real turn of censorship at that time. And they exploited that. I mean, there are many very famous scenes from this, like the horse head in the bed and different things like that, that really showcase that they were able to use extreme violence at that point. Another one, to be honest with you, is Marlon Brando's portrayal in that. I think that that is one of the best acted roles of all time. It's an easy thing to say. It goes without saying that that is one of the best acted roles of all time. Um, there is no easier, on a side note, there's no easier impression to do than The Godfather. So almost all men have a Godfather built into them, and they'll give it to you. You know, oh, I can't believe you're this, you know, and it's a very easy impression. And but it speaks to how unique that was because he built an entire character that is completely recognizable even still today. And you have to keep in mind the 70s was almost 50 years ago, and we still are able to identify with that. It also, to be honest with you, was a masculine film. And there are definitely films that are masculine that have been made. There is no doubt about that. But this one kind of exemplified the masculine role in society as a protector. So it is a very traditional film in that sense, is that it shows that men are this and women are this. And in most of these types of films, women are not portrayed very, very well at all. And this is no exception. Women are not portrayed very, very well. So it is not a feminist film in any way, shape, or form. But that's okay, because there are always counter arguments to every argument, whether it be feminism, masculinism, whatever it is. There are always counter arguments that can be made for things, because life is complicated. And it's not as simple as saying, this is the ideology that life should follow. It's not. There are many, many people that believe in many, many different things, and you have to respect those views for what they can bring to you, because we are all inherently selfish creatures. So what does this view give me as opposed to another view? And then based on that, you can make your own decisions. Why Godfather 2 is number 50, and if I'm not mistaken, it's the only sequel in the top 100. So that speaks to the fact that it was a good movie anyway. Because to be in the top 100, you have to keep in mind this simple fact. To be in the top 100, you have to consider that probably, I'm taking a ballpark figure, so this could be way off. There are probably, in the history of cinema, since the silent films, which we only have a third of, there have been probably close to, I'd say, 500,000 feature films. Ones that have made it somewhere where people could see it. There are probably great films that have been made, but no one was able to see them. That's probably true. And like I said, a third of the silent films that we have, or a third of the collection of all the silent films that we know of are available. And that's it. They find new ones all the time when they go through people's attics, and they're like, oh, wow, this is a completely new silent film. So you have to understand that, you know, there's close to 500,000 films that have been made, since the beginning of film. So if you're in the top 100, that's quite a statement. Not only that, if you're a newer film, and I mean beyond 1980 and now, to be in the top 100 is kind of awe-inspiring, to be honest with you. I'm just getting the hiccups here. Because film had laid its ground and had completed its silver age by the 70s. So, what ends up happening, I might have to pause this for just 1 second here, because I've got some hiccups. So just give me one moment. Alright, I just had the hiccups, so I had to get some water. But you have to keep in mind that after 1980, there was only one more age of cinema, which was the Bronze Age of cinema, which was the 90s. And that was basically because of the independent film movement, which had started in the 60s, but it didn't really take off until then. And now it's just kind of a commercial enterprise. Like, there's not a lot of new films that come out that are extraordinarily complex, because we've seen all of that at this point. So you have to keep in mind that you have an advantage by being older to be in the top 100, because you're laying the foundations for what we call cinema, or storytelling in a visual format with audio as well and color. So that is an advantage. There are about 20 films that are in the top 100 that are past 1980, but most of them are from the 90s and the early 2000s. Monster with Charlize Theron. I'm trying to think. Labyrinth, Dark Crystal. There are things that are there, no doubt. Goonies as well, even though I would be heavily disagree with that it should be in the top 60. I think that it set forth what we call children's cinema or kids cinema. It also included. It's also a buddy uh, children's cinema, which is heavily influential, and even series now like Stranger Things. Like Stranger Things is now it owes its success to the Goonies that came before it. So that's also important to consider. But back to The Godfather. As I said before, this has been talked about a million times, so I'm not going to bring anything truly new to the table on this. But you have to keep in mind that this film really set the tone for realistic filmmaking as well. And there's a lot of things that it did. And again, The Godfather 2 is definitely a good story, don't get me wrong. It's just that it had already been previously set. Like, all of its nuance and newisms, so to speak, were already set before The Godfather 2. And The Godfather 2 is still a great story, and it is about the only sequel I can think of that is in the top 100. I'd have to really think about it. I don't think there is another sequel. Unless you consider, like, well, no, Empire Strikes Back is more in the 150, 170 range. But, so I can't really think of anything else. No, Blade Runner 2. No. So, that's something that sequels usually aren't. Because you have to keep in mind that when you make a sequel, you may make more money, but you've already talked about everything that this is going to be. Like, take, for instance, what's the Mockingjay? The Hunger Games. Like, all four of those films are good. I didn't watch the third one because I didn't think they needed to split that book up into two movies. I thought they could have done a really good trilogy and just left it at that. They chose, for financial reasons, to make all four of them, which I think was a detriment to that actual series, but it doesn't matter now because all of it was good. But once you have the first Hunger Games, you've already established the world, the climate, everything like that. You're not bringing anything new to the table. So even if the second movie, which I would argue is better than the first movie in many ways, it's still not. You've already set a precedence for that, and that's kind of how I believe that storytelling is that you've set up that world. This is how the world functions, and then you're modifying it more and more as you go along. So unless you're bringing something completely new to a sequel, it's usually not going to be considered to be very unique. And that's kind of like what makes really, really great cinema, is that it is a unique endeavor that you're considering here. So that's why it's not. And again, like I said, it was a fantastic trilogy anyway, because even the third one was still good. I know that most people don't consider it to be as good as the first two, which it's not, but it's still a very, very good movie. It's just that it had lost its energy and magnetism by that point, which is fine. That happens. It happens all the time. I mean, eventually we'll get tired of the Fast and Furious, even though they're great movies. I mean, they're just great movies. You go into them, you're going to be entertained. I wanted to see Hobbs and Shaw, but for some reason, it's not playing that much anymore. I don't know why. It really should be, because it's something that you'll be entertained almost every single time. It's almost a guarantee of entertainment when you go to something like that. But regardless, I'm going to leave it at that, because The Godfather is the 8th greatest movie of all time. And there's a reason for that. I've kind of explained all of that. So until then, auf Wiedersehen.